Okay, we're going to start the meeting of the Fidalgo Democrats now. I'm going to welcome everybody, say good evening. Thank you all for coming. And this is going to be a Zoom presentation, as you know, and my name is Barbara Cooper, and I'm chair of the Fidalgo Democrats. And we're going to start the meeting with an acknowledgement, and Sarah Peterson will be reading that for us. So Sarah, if you could do that. Where's Sarah?
Okay.
There she is.
We, the Fidalgo Democrats, acknowledge that we gather on indigenous land, the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Samish and Swinomish. And we pay our respects to the elders of the past, present, and future. I'd like to just also mention to Devin that it was a recommendation from a colleague at Evergreen State College that we contact you, Zoltan, who does so much work with these issues at the college. So thank you for accepting that invitation.
Okay. And I'd like to just let you know, the Fidalgo Democrats are an independent democratic association with a focus on education. So that folks know who we are. I'm going to talk about our next meeting because I got in trouble for not mentioning that. So we meet once a month. Our next meeting is Tuesday, July 13th at 7 o'clock. And we're planning on having several of the candidates who are running for office in Anacortes. And we'll send out the Zoom connection flyer a week or two before, and then again right before the meeting. And that'll have more specifics after we talk to some of the candidates and see who's interested in coming. What I'd like to do now is to recognize any of our elected officials who are from different Skagit County and Democratic Party officials, including PCOs. So if anyone would like to let me know, please raise your hand or just speak up. And after that, I'd like to recognize people who are running for public office as well. So are there any Democratic Party officials or elected officials here tonight? Now I know, Valid, you are.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Valid Savatin, PCO for Dewey Beach, Precinct 119. I'm also on the e-board of the Skagit County Democrats, as well as being the chair of the Gala and Fundraising Committee. Of course, I'm on the Barbara's team also, the Fidalgo Democrats steering team. Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, is there anyone else that would like to be noticed? Hi, Brad, you do a lot.
I'm a PCO over in Burlington and Terrace and the communications director for the Environment and Climate Change Caucus for the state Democrats.
Thank you. Okay, is there anyone else here who would like to be recognized or let us know what you're up to?
Rita.
Rita?
Hi there. Well, I am PCO in Skyline. That's precinct 224. And on the e-board is the 40th district representative.
Okay.
That's it.
Hi, Barb. I'm Jan Robinson. And I'm
Hi, Jan.
PCO out at Rosario. And I'm recruiting PCOs.
Okay.
And here's Wim. I'm a PCO for Precinct 207, Anacortes.
And we're going to have Jan say a few words in a few minutes. I'd like to, there's a few people here who are running for office that I recognize their names. So how about you folks also just kind of giving us, saying hi and letting us recognize your faces since you're going to be running for office here. So anybody want to step up? I know.
Wim and Amanda both have their hands up.
Okay.
All right, I'll go ahead and start. Hi, everybody. My name's Amanda Hewitt. I use she, her pronouns, and I am running for Anacortes City Council, position 4, an at-large position.
Oh, all right.
Very nice.
And I'm Ryan Walters, Anacortes City Council Ward 1, sitting city council member, and I'm running for mayor of Anacortes.
All right.
Very nice.
And I think I see here Anastasia. Let's get you. There you are. Wonderful. And, oh, you're muted.
Well, that helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, great. Good. Thanks for unmuting yourself. Wonderful.
Yeah, you bet. So my name's Anastasia Brensick, and I am running for school board position 1.
Okay. And everyone needs to know Anastasia is going to have to do a primary because there's 2 other people running for the same seat for the school board, which is unbelievable, but unfortunate for her. So thank you for taking it on.
Thank you. And fortunate for me, because if I get a chance to talk to as many people as possible, I get to know what is really of interest to folks. So please, I'm hoping to have more conversations.
Great. And thank you for doing this. It's really important. So is there anyone else that would like to wave their hands and see if I can figure out how to call on you? I think, Wim, I see your hand is up. Is that correct?
Oh, that's a little bit long. I should have lowered it, but since I got the microphone, Ryan Walters also has a primary
That's true.
mayor race. So
You are correct. Thank you for mentioning that. Okay. All right. So thank you all. Thank everybody for all the time and effort to run for public office. It's a very, very important and a lot of work. So it is much appreciated. And now I'm going to have Jan Robinson say a couple of words about, she is organizing for precinct officers for Fidalgo Island. And so I'd like her to just say a couple of words about that.
My apologies, the sun is just so bright in my office here.
Really, it's great.
It's actually really great. So I really do just have a couple of requests. And that is, we need precinct officers to help organize your neighborhoods and keep them abreast of anything that's going on in the county as well. And even the state dams trainings and so on show up through your PCOs, through the precinct commission officers, precinct committee officers, excuse me. So we're looking for folks that might be able to help out in, let me just share with you, if I may. So if any one of these sound familiar to you, over on Guimas, we don't have anybody at the moment. 201 Capsante, 204, 211, 222, 223, and 225. So all of those precincts could use a person or more, but a person in particular to be the PCO. So please do feel like giving Barb a call, give Brad a call. Jan Robinson, you can certainly call me. It's 503-887-6900. And my email is janhrobinson@gmail.com. And I'd love to hear from you. And if you know of somebody and they haven't called me, please let me know their name if you have somebody you think would be a good candidate for this. Thanks.
And if you want to, you could put, if you feel comfortable, you can put your information in the chat so people can do that.
I'd be glad
But,
to.
you know, if anybody, you know, doesn't do that and then they want to, are interested, please feel free to give me a call and I can pass on to Jan. So
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks for all you do. And then Shay wanted to make a quick announcement about the Family Center. Shay, where did I? There you are. Great.
Hi. Yeah, the Anacortes Family Center is having a ribbon cutting tomorrow on our campus from 4 to 6 p.m. As many of you know, many of you are donors. We are mostly privately funded, and we've just been growing by leaps and bounds. So it's a way to say thank you to the community and show you what we've been doing. A few years ago, we were just an emergency shelter with 9 apartments. And then we opened a transitional housing building. And then we opened an affordable housing building. And now our groundbreaking tomorrow is another 21 unit apartment building of truly affordable housing, different than the usual public-private partnership of public housing. This one will remain the property of the Anacortes Family Center in perpetuity, and rental rates will always be affordable. A while back, we passed a 0.1% increase in sales tax in Anacortes, and I think many of you voted for it. Funding from that is going toward helping us pay for this new building. So again, it's a way of saying thank you to the community. We hope that if it floats your boat, feel free to come by. We may be having some tours of buildings. It depends on what's going on with our residents. And there'll be some speeches around 5:15 and the real ribbon cutting. It's usually a very fun event. So I hope to see some of you there.
Thanks, Shay. If you want to, again, you could put the where it is, the location and everything in the chat, so people can don't have to remember, they can see it. So
Okay.
I'm going to move on. And before I introduce Devin Burghardt and Terry Kylo, just want to let you know that Anthony Young wasn't able to make it tonight. He had his niece is graduating, and they allowed people into the ceremony. So he went down there to celebrate with his family. I think it sounded a reasonable thing. And I know Terry is more than capable of taking over and telling us what's going on. Our Zoom host is Brad Klur, who is Skagit Democrats Zoom support team. He'll be handling the muting and unmuting, other technical issues. If you have any problems, let him know, and he can help you do that. Raise your hand and he can help you figure out some computer stuff if you need help off screen. Jeff and I are co-hosts, Jeff Smounts. And the other thing is that we're going to ask folks to please hold their questions till the end, and then we'll do that. The meeting is being recorded, and our videographer is Zane Butler, and he'll make a YouTube, and Rita Sullivan will send out the links. And so if you want to watch that, or you know somebody who missed the meeting and then would like to watch that, please just let them know. And with that, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves in a little more detail. And so the first speaker is Devin Burghardt, who's the president, there he is, thank you, Devin, and executive director of the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. It's a national social justice organization dedicated to standing against bigotry and defending democracy and human rights. And for the last 25 years, Devin has done research and developed new approaches to countering racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, nativism, homophobia, and other forms of bigotry. His work to unmask white nationalists has appeared in multiple media outlets. And so I'm going to let Devin talk more about himself and the Institute and what they're doing. And then we'll move on to the Reverend Terry Kylo. And so Devin, you're on.
Thank you,
Thank
Barbara,
you.
so much. Now let me see if I can get my my slides going here for everyone.
Great.
Oh, the host has disabled participant screen sharing.
Brad? Where is Brad? Okay, he'll fix it.
Okay. Well, fantastic. While Brad's working on that, I'll tell you a little bit about the Institute. The Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights was established in 1983 by Leonard Zeskin, a MacArthur Genius Grant winner who's been doing the most amazing work tracking white.
You're going now, Devin.
Okay, fantastic. Appreciate that. There we go. Perfect. Let's see if I can.
Sorry, I had it.
No worries. Can everyone see that all right?
Yeah, great.
As I was saying, my name is Devin Burkhart. I'm the executive director and president of the board of the Institute. The Institute was established in 1983 to help farmers during the farm crisis, stave off efforts by the far right to infiltrate the farm movement and to take on the rise of the Klan in a new guise, organizations like the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and David Duke's attempt to move white nationalism from the margins to the mainstream. You may have not have heard of us. We're an organization that often works behind the scenes to catalog and archive and report on some of the latest threats to civil and human rights. But we've been around this work for a long time. I myself started doing this professionally in 1993 with the Coalition for Human Dignity in Seattle. And then I went to work for 11 years with the Center for New Community in Chicago and came back to take on the role as vice president of the Institute in 2008. We are a small but powerful organization in terms of our ability to predict what's coming next with the far right and the kind of threats that they pose to civil and human rights. So what I wanted to talk to you today about, and what I've been tasked to try to get across to you today, is what we can do to challenge the far right, both here in Washington State and beyond, because it is, in fact, a grave and growing threat to democracy and civil rights. I want to start by showing this image and just let this sink in for a moment. That horrific attack on January 6th was an assault on our democracy and should be indelibly etched as a stain on the soul of our nation. We mustn't forget how close we came to losing our democracy and to have it come crumbling down at a moment's notice. Tonight, what I've been asked to talk about is where we at IREHR see things heading and what we all can do about it together. So we'll talk about the ties that bind this current anti-democratic insurgency. We'll talk about the status of the far right here in Washington State. And then I'll leave you with a list of 10 things that we all can do to save democracy and protect civil and human rights. Because what we're dealing with here today is not merely a mix of right-wing organizations, but a broader mass movement with violence at its core. It is fundamentally a political movement bent on seizing power. And that, I think, is important because terms like anti-government extremists don't seem quite right any longer. At the same time, words like extremist hold little meaning when the same ideas can be expressed by someone who stormed the Capitol on January 6th and someone already inside the Senate chambers, there to cast a vote to overturn election results. At IREHR, we've been monitoring the far right for a very long time. Right now, something has changed. Something is very different. If you just take a look, for instance, at those who you see on screen, many of whom have been arrested for the Capitol insurrection, we found in looking at those, hundreds of those arrested for the insurrection, they, in fact, were different than previous far rightists of previous eras. They were older. There were more women. They were more likely to be employed, many holding white-collar jobs, business owners, doctors, attorneys, architects, even police officers from places like here in Seattle. They were from all over the country. Something has changed, and we need to identify what that is. So let's start by defining the terrain of this current anti-democratic insurgency, what some of others have called the Maga Coalition. This includes a variety of different movements, from Tea Partiers to QAnon conspiracists to COVID insurrectionists, far-right paramilitaries, racist reactionaries, and even out-and-out white nationalists. Those are the folks who played a role in the insurrection and continue to try to build a base for continuing that insurrection beyond January 6th, heading to 2022, and beyond. Now, have you ever gone into a store, like a 7-Eleven to purchase a candy bar, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer variety and types and brands on the shelves in front of you? In a lot of ways, the anti-democratic insurgency is like that. It's a whole lot of different packages and varieties, but they're all basically the same, and they're also really bad for you. So what do the groups you have listed on there on the screen right now have in common? There are a number of different commonalities which they share and that we need to talk about. The first is that they're fundamentally anti-democratic. The second is that they have a reliance on conspiracies to demonize and dehumanize. The third is a core of racial resentment and a sense of white dispossession. Fourthly, they share a commonality of the importance of nationalism. And lastly, they share a commonality of being anti-progressive, anti-democrat, and anti-left. Specifically, quite often, anti-fascist and anti-Black Lives Matter. So let's examine each of these things in turn, because I think they tell us a lot about the commonalities that bind this movement together. The first of which those are its fundamental anti-democratic approach. From the so-called Stop the Steal efforts to current attacks on voting rights, the efforts to undermine our voting processes and procedures has grown apace over the past year. Efforts to continue to promote the big lie that President Trump somehow won the election and that it was stolen from him undercut the very foundations of our democratic process and erode the support for the institutions that we rely on to carry out the very democratic process. That was true from the days after the election, and it is becoming institutionalized today as hundreds of anti-voting rights pieces of legislation have been introduced in dozens of states around the country. The second thing is a reliance on conspiracy theories. Those conspiracies are used to demonize and dehumanize. There's no better example of that, of course, than the QAnon conspiracy. Now, some have called QAnon a quote unquote big tent conspiracy because it's a constantly evolving conspiracy, adding new claims and ideas and threads. I've described it more as a common vocabulary that's allowed various segments of the far right to talk to one another. It's also an ideology of attack and aggression. On its face, QAnon is a baseless conspiracy whose followers believe that a cabal of Satan-worshiping Democrats, Hollywood celebrities, and billionaires runs the world while engaging in pedophilia and human trafficking. Now, there are many threads of the QAnon narrative, all as far-fetched and evidence-free as the rest, but QAnon has its roots in much older anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The ideas of an all-powerful, world-ruling cabal come straight out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, a forgery purporting to expose a Jewish plot to control the world that was used throughout the 20th century to justify anti-Semitic pogroms and violence against Jewish people. Another QAnon canard, the idea, and I couldn't make this stuff up if I tried, the idea that there are members of this cabal who extract the chemical adrenochrome from the blood of their child victims and inject it to extend their lives is merely just a modern remix of the age-old anti-Semitic blood libel conspiracies. So these conspiracies run deep and provide a commonality that the movement uses to talk to one another. They talk to one another also in the language of racial resentment and white dispossession. Now, it was the Tea Party who first brought up the ideas of racial resentment, white victimhood, and white dispossession, and moved it from the margins to the mainstream. The rise of America First, Make America Great Again activism took it to a whole new level, and it's shifted the trajectory of race relations in a negative direction. A shockingly high number of white folks today now believe that white people are more discriminated against than any other group in the country. It's tough to believe, but that's where this kind of racial resentment has gotten us, undermining the very fabric of reality. They also have a shared sense in the importance of nationalism, defining who is in and who is out of the American story. This is the so-called idea of middle American nationalism that posits that so-called middle Americans, often explicitly or implicitly just white, are being squeezed from above by the elite multiculturalists and from below by the multicultural hordes working in collusion together to squeeze middle Americans. One of the elements of this kind of exclusionary nationalism is having an enemy to define themselves in opposition to. For the right, they found a common enemy in Black Lives Matter and anti-fascists who protest and demonstrate against the kind of racism and bigotry that many of these groups have promoted. When millions took to the streets to stand up for Black lives and demonstrate against continuing police killings of Black folks, far rightists mobilized to harass and harm Black Lives Matter demonstrators. The most prominent of these groups, of course, you see featured here is the Proud Boys. Started in 2016 by Canadian expatriate Gavin McGuinness, what I call the harbinger of hipster racism. His group started off as a racist and misogynist drinking fraternity, but quickly pivoted to become the street soldiers of the far right. They cast themselves as right-wing death squads and sold t-shirts declaring that fascist dictator Augusto Pinochet did, quote unquote, nothing wrong when he had leftists tossed from helicopters. Now, you by now have undoubtedly heard of their battles in places like Seattle and Portland and Philadelphia and the other locations where the group is engaged in large-scale political street violence against opponents. If you hadn't heard of that troubling activity, you probably heard of them when President Trump gave them a shout out during the first presidential debate, telling them to, quote unquote, stand back and stand by. And they did. At least a dozen Proud Boys now have been arrested for their involvement in the Capitol insurrection. Their sergeant at arms was a bodybuilding brawler from Auburn, Washington, and they continue to pose a threat to local communities and have already started marching in a more openly white nationalist direction. For instance, this attempt to fight against Black Lives Matter is not going away, and now far rightists, including the Proud Boys, have scheduled events like these here, the so-called White Lives Matter rallies, which took place in 22 states in April, including an event in downtown Seattle. So with these commonalities, what's next in 2021 for Washington State? We need to look beyond the insurrection and look at the three main things where we could see some commonalities, where they're likely to mobilize. As we sit here today, there are three main areas that they may likely galvanize mass opposition around. For the shorthand, we refer to this as the CGI plan. Not computer graphics or anything so funky, but instead we're talking about three critical issues likely to define the next year: COVID-19, guns, and immigration. On the first one, COVID-19 and the related conspiracies, this is an important one that has far-reaching consequences and has not nearly received the kind of coverage that deserves. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic gave rise to massive far-right opposition to keeping Americans safe. By the summer of 2020, IREHR was tracking more than 3.2 million people in more than 1,100 COVID insurrection groups on Facebook alone. These groups demanded premature reopening of the economy, pushed COVID conspiracies, modeled insurrectionist tactics, and even stormed state capitals before it happened in DC. They helped distort public opinion, injecting xenophobia into the public health crisis. And due to their efforts, believe it or not, earlier this year, 40% of Americans said they believed that the xenophobic lie that coronavirus was made in a lab in China. These groups provided an on-ramp onto the radicalization conveyor belt for anti-vaxxers and other new constituents. They also brought more women to the movement, as you see featured here. Among those 3.2 million people, Washington State ranked fourth nationally, with 32 different groups attracting more than 177,000 members. And no group better represents the trajectory of the COVID insurrectionists than Ammon Bundy's group, People's Rights. You may know him from other failed insurrection attempts, whether that be in in Nevada or in Oregon, Ammon Bundy's formed an organization called People's Rights, which has coalesced anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, other COVID insurrectionists, along with militia types and far-right paramilitaries, and even out-and-out white nationalists. People's Rights has grown nationally to 16 states and over 22,000 members as of our report in October, which you can find on our website. Here in Washington State, People's Rights has 12 area assistants for 9 areas and 5,325 members. The largest subunits you see featured here, it being 2S, with 1,119 members, and Area 4 with 1,071. The Washington State chapter also had a Facebook group and 9 additional Facebook sections. The statewide group had 1,746 members, and they were able to draw from across the state to drive efforts to try to fight against fighting the pandemic. They've made it hard to do their job. They've been involved in conflicts in Battle Ground, Vancouver, Yakima, Goldendale, Longview, Snohomish, Spokane, Deer Park, Tacoma, Camas, Chehalis, Kennewick, and many other communities around the state. But they're not done there. They've decided now to pivot from COVID-19 in some places to trying to split different states. In Oregon, for instance, People's Rights activists are active trying to split the state of Oregon in two and absorb most of the southern and eastern part of the state into what they're calling Greater Idaho. They're also significantly involved in an effort in the Klamath River Basin, which I encourage you to pay close attention to, as it could be the most important hotspot this summer. Due to a severe drought down there, People's Rights activists are threatening to take over this station you see featured here and remove the blockade to the canal, thereby draining the upper basin of the Klamath River Basin, threatening the livelihoods and the lives of many upstream, and creating an armed standoff, which could grow volatile like those in Malheur and Bunkerville have done. It is a flashpoint that we need to pay very close attention to, and is also very closely related to the second of those 3 areas in the CGI plan. That's guns. You know, between recent armed insurrections at state capitals around the country and yet another spate of mass murder by firearms, there's been a push by the Biden administration and some state legislatures to pass gun safety measures and limits to armed protests at state capitals, like the one that passed in Olympia and Salem recently. This has rekindled organizing efforts by different far-right paramilitary organizations, including militias, so-called Oath Keepers, and Boogaloo Boys. These are groups that were involved in the Capitol insurrection, were on the streets holding rallies, armed, of course, storming state capitals as the armed wing of the COVID insurrection, and attacking Black Lives Matter activists during the demonstrations over the police killings of George Floyd. Paramilitarism as a tactic is used as a tactic to force political will by threat of political violence. Now, there are those on the far right who have decided that our changing demographics and political trajectory are no longer acceptable, and they've decided to form paramilitary militia groups to wage a second civil war. They've drawn on Second Amendment mythology, the right to keep and bear arms, as a call to revolution. They've wrapped their rhetoric in the mythology around the nation's founding and troubling and deeply disturbing interpretations of the Constitution. You know, I would be remiss to note if I didn't parenthetically note that in the early days of our country, the primary purpose of the militia was to round up fugitive slaves and to assist in the genocide of Native Americans. But this has been a far-right tactic for years, you know, going back to the Posse Comitatus of the 1980s and the militia movement in the 1990s. However, the Oklahoma City bombing has forever tarnished the militia brand, and now they have new packaging. You know, everything needs new packaging, apparently. Some call themselves 3%ers, a name drawn from a mythology that there were just 3% of colonists who rose up to overthrow the British, you know, and when not engaging in Islamophobic rallies or prepper trainings, these groups provide security for groups like the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer. They were even on the streets of Charlottesville back in 2017. Others, like the Oath Keepers you see featured here, have targeted recruiting efforts at members of the military and law enforcement. And then, of course, there are the Boogaloo Boys, the folks you see featured there in the Hawaiian shirts. While the name might seem silly, their violence is deadly serious. Developed initially as a way to avoid getting kicked off of internet platforms, the name is an oblique reference to the desire to kickstart a second civil war. IREHR currently tracks 28 of these types of groups here in Washington state, including some doing organizing to cleave off Eastern Washington into its own state. In our database, we've got over 19,000 members of various militia type groups here in the state. We're seeing efforts of paramilitary far right to regroup after the Capitol insurrection. The three percenters of Washington have been on a charm offensive, trying to distance themselves from the militia moniker. And, folks like Lauren Culp, the former gubernatorial campaign, has launched a new political action committee to try to ignite the right once again. That name sounds awfully familiar. They're going to continue to organize here in the state and, pay close attention to our website or follow our traffic on social media as details come for that. Lastly, and this is important because it's where Generation Next is getting involved, is immigration. Though it is not yet a massive issue, we anticipate this will become a significant national fight sometime this year or early next. Not only will national anti-immigrant groups like the Federation for American Immigration Reform attempt to demonize immigrants and further toxify our political climate, expect local groups like Respect Washington to get in the act as well. Coming soon, we're going to release a report with other national immigrants' rights organizations called Nativism, Inc., how the anti-immigrant movement is funded, which will document kind of how this happens and what's going on. Because this isn't merely a policy fight, it's about defining who and what we are as a nation in the 21st century. I think it's important for us to remember that this is a struggle that will remain with us as we continue to go through these demographic changes and finally live up to the ideas of being a more perfect union. There is already a group of Zoomers, young people in their 20s, who have picked up the white nationalist America First banner of nativism. Take, for instance, the case of Nicholas Fuentes, the person you saw featured in the last slide, a 22-year-old white nationalist from the Chicago suburbs. Just weeks after he attended the murderous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, he was invited to speak at an exclusive anti-immigrant writers workshop. Since then, he's built up an army of so-called groypers who have pushed white nationalist themes on immigration on college campuses. White groypers now control dozens of college GOP chapters and are transforming the next generation of leaders. Fuentes also helped lead those Stop the Steal efforts we saw earlier, efforts that culminated in the insurrection at the Capitol. Believe it or not, Fuentes also has over 125,000 followers on Twitter. Last year, he held last month, or 2 months ago now, actually, he held a conference in Orlando that drew former Congressman Steve King and sitting Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona. He received a donation of Bitcoin today worth nearly $500,000, and he's building his own streaming empire to pump white nationalism and misogyny to the homes of impressionable young people across the country. For more on him, I encourage you to read our report From Alt-Right to Groyper, White Nationalist Rebrand for 2020 and Beyond, as you see featured there. As my colleague Leonard Zeskin wrote in the preface to his book, Blood and Politics, white nationalists are preparing for the year 2042, when white nationalists will no longer be, when white people will officially become a minority in a nation of minorities. Your children and grandchildren will be fighting this fight, and the objective conditions of this battle depend on what we all do today. So I know we've spent a lot of time on this, and I'm going to keep this brief, but I want to give you quickly 10 tips that you can use to respond to bigoted organizing in your community and to defend democracy. The first thing that you can do is inoculate. You can take steps to counter the far right even before they come to town, by getting involved in constituency-based groups in your community, by volunteering in an organization in your community that works on civil rights, immigrants' rights, human rights, or racial, economic, or gender or environmental justice. The second thing that's important, and this is a subject that of course is near and dear to my heart, is that you can research and document. Documenting the facts about a white nationalist or a bigoted group and its actions can be the first step in ending the denial and the silence that allows these groups to grow. Solid information can allow you to expose and counter the bigotry promoted by those groups and determine where they're targeting for recruitment and help you figure out which steps you need to take to cut them off at the pass. The third thing that you need to do is reach out to the community and build coalitions. Once you've done some research, reach out to community groups and let them know that this is happening. Share information that you found and call people together to discuss a response. The fourth thing is develop a message that offers both counters the message of the white nationalists and offers alternatives. You've got to do both. You've got to be able to both denounce their efforts and the bigotry that they expose, or that they purport, and counter with alternatives to the issues that they're trying to seize upon. Fifthly, you need to speak out, holding a counter event or other other series of events to try to let people know that they're not facing the fear alone, but instead they can face that fear together, is essential to really building long-term efforts in your community, and speak out against these issues. Sixthly, you've got to engage the press, right? You've got to let them know that your community does not tolerate this kind of message, and that you're going to instead be able to have a united voice in opposition, so that they can't continue to grow in the silence and that they hope to bring about in a community when they come to town. Seventh is you got to encourage community leaders to speak out, right? Get people from business and labor, from civil and governmental organizations, from nonprofit organizations, from religious institutions, and from as many different walks of life as you can. Encourage them to speak out and speak to their communities and their constituents, to let them know that this stuff is happening and that there is a united community response in opposition. Eighthly, working constituencies targeted for recruitment. Now, this one's really important. You want, many things can lead people to join or be influenced by far-right groups, including frustration, fear, anger, and existing bigotry. While these groups are often driven by narrow and bigoted views, they may attempt to target people based on a variety of issues impacting the community. They can include economic, cultural, and political issues. Study the messages being used to recruit and develop counter messages and alternatives. Reach out to leaders in communities targeted for recruitment and encourage them to do the work that needs to be done for the short and long term. Ninthly is target your community for long-term solutions. Remember that the fight against bigotry is a marathon, not a sprint. That this is a long-term effort. And while the arc of the moral universe may bend towards justice, it is only going to do so if we don't allow the foundations to be eroded by far-rightists who are every day working to undermine the pillars that hold up that moral arc of the universe. And lastly, encourage peer-based responses among young people. Remember that this is a fight that they're going to have to deal with and their children are going to have to deal with. But don't tell them how to do it. Just encourage the kind of efforts that they're doing, and support the work that they're doing for the long term. Lastly, I want to make sure that there are some other resources for you. I went through that pretty quickly, so you can find more materials in our toolkit for how to respond to bigotry in your community on our smartphone app called Trepper, the anti-bigotry app. You see here, which is available in both the Google Play Store and the App Store. Not only will it provide you that toolkit, it'll allow you to video incidences of bigotry that you see and securely submit them to us, which will allow us to help alert people to things that are going on. It'll provide you instant push notifications about things that are happening in your community so you can get involved. And it'll provide you other tools in the long-term fight against bigotry and connect you to other folks who are doing the similar work. I want to emphasize that democracy is not a spectator sport, that while it is a nonpartisan issue, the essence of protecting democracy relies on each and every one of us stepping up to do the kind of work necessary to make sure that we're moving things forward and we're protecting the right to vote and the civil and human rights of everyone. In doing so, we can become that more beloved community that Dr. King talked about. And in doing so, we can become that more perfect union. I want to thank you all. And if you got any questions, here's my contact information. I'll also put it in the chat. Thanks a lot.
Well, have to take a deep breath there. That was a lot of information. To be blunt about it, I'm sorry that you had to provide it to us. It's a kind of a horrifying, but very important to know about what's going on. And so we're going to wait on questions for Devin, and I'm going to introduce the next speakers. I saw that Anthony Young came in. So what I'll do is Terry Kylo and Anthony Young are the co-founders of IDEA, which is called Inclusion, Diversity, Equity in Anacortes. Hi.
Hey,
Hi.
can you hear me?
You sure can.
Listen, I thank you for allowing me to dial in remotely, and I apologize for not being there as I promised. I always try to keep my promises, but given COVID, my niece here was graduating from high school in Seattle, and it was starting at the exact same time. So all I want to say to all of you is thank you very much. The IDEA group, Terry and I founded this group with the hopes of building a community of people of diverse colors, thoughts, ideas. The purpose is so that we could talk, about things that were important to us, historic things, the painful things, but also the good things. What we realized that with so much of our world tearing us apart and talking about differences, we needed an organization and a group that would build on the commonality, that would fight for each of us to have that right, to have our voices heard. And it's just truly been a beautiful thing. We started out early on with just about 12 people. I think that's about right. Terry will correct me. But at the end of the day, the goal was for those 12 people, we had Native American, African American, Asian American, Caucasian, everything from Christian to Baha'i, and agnostic, and Muslim. And so what the goal was for us to bond, to feel like we have a village of good people here in Anacortes, because quite honestly, when people come to our beautiful town, they don't get a chance to truly see the diversity that's here. And in a way, we always felt that we were in the shadows, and we thought that if we could bring all of the diverse thinkers out to recognize each other and to love one another and try to find that middle ground of understanding people. And that's what we fought for. It took us a while, really, because it was so much that needed to come out of all of us and be brought bare to the table. And believe it or not, even the pain of my coming from the South, I brought to the table, but I also brought the hope. And as we spoke with other people there at the table, including the Caucasians, they have pain too. And so we were all living and loving one another. We bonded extraordinarily well. And so the one thing I really wanted to add tonight, as I'm sure Terry will have a wonderful presentation for all of you, is to say that we have an extraordinary town. We do, but there's work we have to do. We cannot allow us, meaning as the majority of people here, good people, to be silent, because our world is being decided for us. Either we choose to participate, or the rules would be made for us and on us. And I think an old expression they said in the South was, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. So, but, you know, there are things we need to work on. And so as the city, I will give you an example. You know, of course, I'm running unopposed for city council again, and I'm humbled and I'm honored to be trusted with this public service duty. And I promise you, I will always give it my best. I will be honest, and I will stand alone if I believe it's worth it. And so what I'm saying to you is that our city right now is doing diversity and inclusion and equity training. It's just such that when anyone comes to our town of diverse views, thoughts, ideas, that we're ready for it. We have had the experience to allow their voices to be heard and to not let unconscious bias, which we all have, and conscious bias be the ruling rule of thought. So I applaud our Mayor Gear for really knuckling down this past year in particular. And also, you know, the work that's being done in our school systems, those are things that we have to continue. There are those who wish the truth of our histories not be taught. And the problem with that is, are we going to teach a fairy tale, or are we going to teach true history and then figure out how we move from here? But if we don't deal with the truth, we can't get to this togetherness that we've always wanted. Dr. King, you know, so eloquently gave in his speech, so many others that have worked to provide and bring us here where we are. And the last thing I want to add is that we each look for someone to come along, but that someone is really you. It's me, it's us. There are things that we can do, and we have to, because the RBG, the John Lewis, all of those others have passed this baton in this relay race to us. Our challenge is to give the best that we can from our heart and help shape the world that we want others to inherit. And so, you know, I just want you to know that I appreciate this opportunity to be here. I thank you for allowing me to dial in. And I hope that as this movement continues, that each of you will look to your heart and do something to help us move forward. So thank you. Thank you, Barbara.
Oh, thank you so much, Anthony, for taking the time out, and congratulations to your niece.
All right, I'm going to hang up if it's okay, but thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you coming.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, well, that was a wonderful surprise. I wasn't expecting Anthony to come on. So he kind of explained a little bit about the IDEA group, and I'm going to introduce Reverend Terry Kylo. He's a Lutheran pastor. Hi, Terry. Serving as the executive director of Paths to Understanding, Bridging Bias and Building Unity. Terry has learned that when we forget how to recognize other humans, we lose part of our own humanity. Terry believes we do not have to live this way. Terry's leadership has been recognized by the Faith Action Network, the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, and the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. He's also written several books and has been featured on several media outlets. He has received multiple awards for his work in countering Islamophobia, racism, human rights, and building multi-faith relationships. So with that, I'm going to let him take over and talk more about this IDEA group and himself. And thank you. Thank you for taking the time to come tonight. It's really appreciated.
Well, thank you, Barbara. And I know that we want to get to some questions, especially for Devin, and I want to really honor the work that he and his organization are doing and the excellent analysis and research that they are bringing to help us all understand what's happening in our country and in our state. So I grew up in La Crosse, Washington, in Eastern Washington State, and just down the street where I could see from my porch when my dad and I would sit out in the evenings, in the summer evenings there and watch the sun go down, there was actually a small church that had been turned into an armory for a Aryan Nations group in town. And so I grew up in a community in which white Christian nationalism, supremacy were woven into the fabric of everything. in part because when you benefit from the oppression of a people, that is the land taken from the Palouse peoples, you have to hate them to live with yourself. You have to dehumanize them to live with yourself. And so I remember being a little kid in church and singing the song, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. And then going out to the parking lot after that and listening to the men use all kinds of racial slurs. And so I grew up in this kind of, there was an ideal that we talked about inside, but there was a reality that was very much enforced outside. And then I went to seminary and I learned about our Jewish neighbors and how Lutherans were in denial about what was happening to our Jewish neighbors. We're participating in it. We're building in some of the anti-Semitism into sermons and into everyday life, and then ultimately did not stand with their Jewish neighbors. And I remember saying to my fellow classmates as we sat very, very quietly after that class, taking stock of our own tradition's failure, that if something similar happened while we're pastors, let's don't be silent. But of course, it was happening all around. And as I was going to seminary in Chicago, to our Black and Hispanic and other neighbors. But again, I was born in white supremacy, and so I could not see that fully. So about 6-7 years ago, I began to get into a relationship with a Muslim man, and we did some conversation in Oak Harbor to try to counter some of the anti-Muslim bigotry there. And it was there on that stage that I saw the depth of the fear and the anxiety and the rage directed at my friend, who is a mild-mannered real estate agent. And that experience of seeing that rage firsthand, watching people focus on him that way, and plus my experience as a parish pastor and seeing the ideological spectrum of our communities get more and more and more distorted. Instead of a traditional bell curve, it was all of a sudden all the edges, all the very extremes were getting higher, and that bell curve was flattening with the edges going up. I wish I had an image for you of that. And so I felt that happening as a parish pastor, recognizing that there was more responses to what would be a normal kind of sermon. And then I saw this hate toward my Muslim friend, and I began to realize that there were hate groups spending 30-40 million a year to dehumanize them, to build these conspiracies that built on anti-Semitism, that built on other forms of racism, that built on white nationalism, that built on anti-immigrant sentiment. And so I resigned from parish ministry to work to counter anti-Muslim bigotry, seeing that as one way to slice into the problems that Devin is speaking about, and to try to help convince pastors and church leaders, faith communities of all kinds, to get off the sidelines and to begin to act and to stand together in public and not be passive, because that's the great sin of many of us, is our passivity, our denial about the real dangers that exist in this moment and not doing anything about it. So I was teaching a bunch of courses at Holden Village, Washington, up there, and I got a text from Anthony, and he said that there was a noose hung in Anacortes. And so I left up there early, and that's no small feat coming from Holden. I got home and I called him up and we talked about it some. And it was devastating to think that what James Cone, a great Black theologian, has called the cross of our time, right? The lynching was a way to do not state-sponsored terror exactly, but almost state-sanctioned terror across this country, in the same way that the cross was really state terror against people in Palestine whose land and property and livelihoods had been taken from them. The Romans crucified about 20,000 a year. In our country, 50,000 people at least are known to have been lynched and terrorizing an entire community. And so I went to the city council that night, and I walked in a bit late because I wasn't keeping track of things too well, apparently. And I kind of felt like, you know, Anthony had spoken, but I also felt like there wasn't too much, there wasn't quite a clear signal of what was supposed to happen from the city council. Like, what do we do with this here? You know, because, you know, Anacortes, our story is that we're all nice and white, and we don't have racist issues here, and we're all good and kind and Northwest, and we don't like conflict. And if we just give these things too much oxygen, they're going to multiply. Of course, sometimes bacteria multiply just fine in an anaerobic environment. And so I went and spoke, and then began to work with quite a few city council people on a resolution which was passed. And I want to thank you know, Councilperson Walters for supporting that resolution, that the city council would speak out in case there was racist language and hate speech in our town, because given the Supreme Court's ruling, there is no response to hate speech except other speech. And so out of that experience, a lot of people of color began to kind of coalesce and come together and get to know each other better. And so Anthony proposed that we start the idea group. And we weren't exactly sure what it would be at first, but what we knew it had to be was a place where people of color and white folk that had done some of their work to come together and get to know each other and support each other, because as Anthony said, there is just so very much pain. And so we've spent a lot of the last couple of years just healing with each other and supporting different efforts each of us have made, supporting efforts throughout the city. And we're starting to expand our group just a little bit now, and try to be a place where people of color, when they come to town, can come and kind of take a deep breath and know for a moment or two that that some of the white nationalism that is here, that I certainly experienced last year on the corner of 12th and Commercial, some of the violent rhetoric, some of the violence toward our young people, and the violence that I experienced myself on the part of white nationalists, white supremacists, you know, where they wouldn't have to deal with that for a few minutes, and know that they have a community to be with them. So I don't really want to say any more. We're still a work in progress, but I just want to say in closing that I really began to feel, you know, without maybe the same data that Devin has, the change in the distribution of ideas in this country toward ideas that really are going to be detrimental to democracy and to solving our issues through policy and voting. And we've seen that in the last few years. And so it's been a pleasure to be part of the idea group. It's been a blessing to do the work to try to counter anti-Muslim bigotry across the state and across the country. And there's a lot more that we're working on to try to help get people out of this passive role and get them to be active bystanders and to stand with people of color of any tradition, so that we can, as Devin said, work for a more perfect union together and stand up together for a democracy that benefits everyone. Thank you, Barbara.
Well, thank you so much, Terry. It's wonderful that you're doing this work in Anacortes, particularly, which seems very white. And so it's nice to have someone who's realizing that that's not really an accurate portrayal of our community. What I'm going to do now is we will open up to questions and comments, but I want to do a little bit of talking about that before. You're pretty much all muted, and we can, to unmute yourself, there's a little icon at the bottom. It's on the left. And if you put your little arrow on that, it unmutes you, or I can unmute you as well. The other way to unmute is to hold down the space bar on your keyboard, and that'll unmute you. As far as raising hands, if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a little icon on the right that says reactions. Excuse me. And when you click on that, you'll see a little yellow hand emoji. And if you click on that, you can, I will see that. Excuse me, let me take a drink, sorry. Allergies, sorry guys. You'll see your name come up in the chat. And I can call on you, and I'll ask people, if you only have part of your name on the screen, to please put your full name there. So if you're having any computer issues, Brad can help you. So let me open it up to everybody if people have questions. So I'm going to get into the chat and see if people would like to ask questions. Okay, I see Marshall. Marshall, I see that you are raising your hand. Is that accurate? Marshall Goldberg?
Got my hand up.
Okay.
Do it again, it fell off. Do it again, it fell off. Okay, I have a comment.
Okay, well, Marshall raised his hands first, but I can't seem to.
This is Don and Marie Ibsen.
No, I know, but I'm looking at Marshall because he had his hand raised and I can't seem to catch on to him yet.
Okay.
Marshall? Are you there? Okay, well, I'll let you folks go and then maybe we can get back to Marshall. Sorry.
Yes, okay, Reverend Terry, I appreciate all the work you're doing, and Marie and I are doing our part too in trying to bring people together of different ethnic backgrounds, and we're doing a small part, and I think it's not a big part, but I think the small parts add up. That picture over your left shoulder, was that Tracy, Reverend Tracy and Reverend Levine by chance?
So yes, so my organization is the merger of two organizations. One is Neighbors in Faith, which was my countering anti-Muslim bigotry effort on that Lutherans and Episcopalians helped to support. And then it's also the merger of the Tracy Levine Center, which was Camp Brotherhood out by Lake McMurray. And so I visit Father Tracy once a month or so, and we are continuing on their work, which began with a rabbi seeing anti-Catholic bigotry in the 1960s and wanting to counter it with a TV program in which a rabbi, a Roman Catholic, and a Protestant pastor talked about everyday issues and important issues of the day. And so, yes, that's their picture right there, and I'm a part of that organization.
I watched that TV show on Sundays regularly back in the 60s.
Yeah, 60s and 70s. They had about 200 people watching the show every week. And we actually have another show right now hosted by Jeff Renner.
That's true.
So if you go to our Paths to Understanding website, you can find in our media podcasts, and if you go to our YouTube channel, you can also see all of our Challenge 2.0 videos. And then we also have an online learning platform, which we are working on really hard right now.
I believe the name of that show was called Challenge.
It was, and that's why the new show is called Challenge 2.0.
Oh, wow. Okay. Wow.
So we still have Marshall. I don't know if you can hear me. You're still.
I can hear you. I can hear you, Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yeah, your hand is raised, and so I was going to ask you to ask your questions or make a comment.
Yeah, you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Marshall.
Playing with all my devices, and I just happened to, I didn't have my microphone turned on. So let me start out by saying I was absolutely enthralled with the presentation that Devin made. One, I had not known about the organization. And as he said, you work behind the scenes. And I would say you're doing a very good job of working behind the scenes. because this is the first I've heard of your organization, and I didn't realize your longevity and the scope of your work. The reason why I mention this is because I have supported the Southern Poverty Law Center for many, many years. Their work to me is critical. And now I realize there's another organization, and I'm going to look into maybe supporting you and your organization because of it. But in that regard, I have two questions. One, how does your work interface with the work of the Southern Poverty Law Center? There might be some crossover. I know that the Southern Poverty Law Center publishes reports that are nationally recognized that even law enforcement use. They have a relationship with law enforcement. So I'm curious as to how your organization interfaces with them and what you do that they don't do, and vice versa. And the last thing is, I didn't realize, and I'm curious about your organization, how much personal threats, how much in the way of personal threats accrue to members of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I'm thinking of the erstwhile director, Morris Dees, because I was interested in having him come here to speak because I admired his work, et cetera, the work of others. And I realized in order to get him here, I had to engage personal security for him because he's had death threats. So I'm wondering, on that note, if you would share some of your thoughts about the questions that I raised.
Sure, I'd be happy to. We have over the many years worked closely with the Southern Poverty Law Center in terms of sharing information and intelligence that we've gathered in the field. A lot of times, I think because we're a smaller, more nimble institution that has a slightly more progressive leaning, it allows us to be kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of things. And in some instances, we've helped kind of pull the Southern Poverty Law Center in the direction of key and important issues and gotten them into the fight. An example of that certainly is around immigration. Back in the early 2000s, we were watching a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment around the country, particularly after 2001. And for a time there, SPLC thought that it wasn't necessarily their issue, but I think both because of our longstanding relationship with them and because of the grave and growing threat we were facing, they kind of moved in that direction. We kind of helped get them on board. They've gone through a lot of changes there over the last couple of years, between Morris having to leave the organization and some of the other staffers have left as well and formed other organizations. We now have a variety of different partners we work with, including the Southern Poverty Law Center, folks like the Global Network Against Hate and Bigotry. I think that's what it's called. Heidi Byrick's organization. She was formerly the head of the intelligence project there at the Southern Poverty Law Center. She's now got a new organization doing work globally, and we work pretty closely with her. As to how we're different, aside from our kind of, generally being a little bit more lean and focusing on that cutting edge and that space between the kind of hardcore white nationalists and the mainstream, we kind of focus on that malleable middle and try to figure out where those interactions are occurring. I think the other thing that really separates us apart is our focus has been less on developing relationships with law enforcement to have them respond to the challenge of white nationalism. SPLC's take has largely been, although not exclusively, that this is a law enforcement problem that needs to be dealt with in kind of a law and order approach, and that these folks are doing things that should get them arrested and or sued out of existence. I think that's amazing. But our approach has always been that this is a social and political response that requires community engagement primarily, and that's where our focus has been, trying to develop effective barriers against bigotry in communities all around the country. And sometimes that becomes difficult with law enforcement, particularly when there are law enforcement who get involved in far right organizations. And so by staying primarily focused on addressing the community component and trying to develop that base of support, it means that we have less of those conflicts over, community activists who are concerned about the movement for Black lives or, keeping us safe in our communities. So that's one of the big differences. The other one is, we are the American hub of an international network of other organizations like ours around the country who do similar work. So a group like the Anti-Fascist Press Archive in Berlin, Searchlight in the UK, Expo in Sweden, Reflex in France. I have the amazing ability to, fortunate I'm fortunate to be able to say that I'm one of the few Americans who shares a byline with Stieg Larsson. You ever heard of Stieg Larsson, the guy who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? I worked with him for years doing similar work while he was running Expo. And we worked on a number of projects and wrote several pieces together. I would see him at conferences every year and I'd ask him how he was doing. He'd say, "Oh, I'm working on a novel." And like many of my college friends, I'd say, "Oh, that's great, Steve. Good for you. Good to have a hobby." Little did I know that it would become, a massive, bestseller and turned into a trilogy of films. Sadly, he wasn't alive to see the results of all that hard work. But not only did I learn, how incredible he really was in those years working with him, but I also learned never to doubt anyone when they said they're working on a project. You always pay closer attention to it.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. But my question is, how about the security? How have you felt insecure or threatened in your organization? Anybody else in your organization felt threatened?
Yeah, we've received our share of threats over the years. It comes with the territory. For instance, a guy by the name of Dennis Mahon who's now serving multiple consecutive life sentences for sending out a series of mail bombs to different individuals, including a local NAACP leader and some other Jewish activists. One of the folks he targeted was our founder, Leonard Zeskin, while he was doing that. So yeah, we've experienced those. There are times where we've had to go to the office wearing a flak jacket. It comes with the territory, but we're really well trained in dealing with that stuff. And for me personally, I know that the kind of threats that I receive sporadically, in the course of doing this work is nothing compared to the daily threats that people of color, people of different sexual orientations and others feel on a daily basis. So if for a moment I can use my white skin privilege to try to flip that on its head and do some good for the long term, I think that's that's the least I can do as my part of the work to counter white supremacy. I started this work back in the early 90s, working for the Coalition for Human Dignity. And as an intern, the first thing they did was send me undercover to militia meetings and Klan rallies and white power music concerts and everything else, both to get a better sense of the necessity of security and to help me understand that there are people involved in this and, to dispel a lot of the myths. And part of my work ever since has been revolving around, not only teaching others to do that kind of work, but also in helping people understand the kind of threats that folks deal with on a daily basis. So yeah, it's part of the work, but I think that there's a lot that left to be done for all of us if we unite and face this fear together.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, are there any
And
other?
if I can just add to that for a second, it was really hard the first time I received a threat. And soon after the Trump was elected, I went and led an event in Mukilteo, and we had members of hate groups there to disrupt the event, and it was kind of scary, and it took a while to kind of, it takes a while to sort of get that, sort of incorporate that into your daily life, right? And then you realize that my partner Anila, who wears a hijab, she is in more danger than me every day of the week, right? Than I am at an event, and I can take my collar off and my suit coat off and go to Safeway after an event, and I'm fine. And she still faces that. So we want to be smart about it, but we also can't, sit back and not stand up with each other and behind each other just because of those threats, because then the fascists win every time.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they'd like to share? I do. I think is one of the interesting things about fear is that months ago when Biden was elected, Karine and I and another man, Stephen, were involved in a national groups, it was a coalition of groups. And we had talked about getting on the streets and going, yay, Biden won and all that. And these national groups said, don't do it. And they said, it's too dangerous. None of you or most of you will not be armed. You're going to be walking up and down the streets. And this was, a national group telling us not to do it. And if we're talking about in Anacortes on Sunday, we've always gotten together from 12 to 1. And one corner was always, the trumpets and all the people like that, and now it's turned into the nationalist groups and militia groups. And again, these groups are saying the other, more progressive and not even progressive, just other groups saying to us, be very careful if you decide to go into the street to protest or to congratulate or celebrate, because of even there's a real serious risk. And so this is kind of an interesting dilemma of people in terms of going out and doing that. What do you both think of that? Any opinions about that or thoughts about that for people?
Terry?
Sure. So, I think we have to use judgment. I think we also have to realize that in the list of 10 things that Devin put out there, in the list of things that Tim Snyder in his wonderful book said things to do to kind of reduce the likelihood of fear taking over the way that it could. Protesting on the street is just like one of them.
Right.
So there was a time last fall when I would go over and talk with people over there, and some of those people freaking hate my guts. I mean, and I was able to talk to some of them, and I actually went over well after the election and talked to a few folk too, and was able to have productive conversations. And then there was a period of time leading up to the election and right afterward where I said, I'm just not going to walk over there. I'm going to not use the crosswalk, because we have to also think about what is the chilling effect if someone were to lose it over there, engage in that kind of violence, and how would that impact everyone else on the other corners. But I think we have to keep in mind all the ways that we need to be working to counteract the kind of fear and that means in part like trying to be a part of groups that trying to reach out to groups and associations in town that we don't necessarily agree with and get to know people and help make all those kind of connections that IDEA is in part about, and just helping people to see other folk as human. And I just think there's an awful lot that can be done. But I don't want to put all the focus on the protesting. I think it's important to do, but we have to recognize all the other tools in the toolbox. Devin, what do you think?
I completely agree. I think that while it is important that we make sure that we protect our right to protest and our right to engage in that kind of speech, it is not the only method in which to do that kind of work. I mean, I think that there are multitudes of different ways, and we list a bunch of them in some of the stuff on the smartphone app, about ways in which people can get involved and continue to do this work. And that includes things like voting, right? Making sure that you're registered and you get out to vote, because as they continue to chip away at that right and make it harder to participate in other parts of the country, those of us need to do what we can and have our voices be heard at the ballot box, as well as on the soapbox, and any other way we can find a medium to reach out to others. I think, as Terry was also saying, it's also important for us to identify areas that are ripe for recruitment and develop relationship in those spaces and in those communities. So whether it be folks going through difficult economic times, or it be folks, dealing with, issues around the homeless crisis, or it be around issues where they're dealing with changes in demographics, or a variety of other areas. By paying attention to where the far right is attempting to recruit from, you can intercede in those spaces and make it possible for their recruiting efforts to be more difficult, and in fact find new members and breed new life to the organizations that you work for, right? So it's part of that work of identifying those spaces and identifying those leaders and those individuals with whom you can work and develop those long-term community bonds that make, the kind of stuff that white nationalists want to prey upon harder to sink root into a community. One of the things we've learned over the years is that when a group targets a community, the first thing that they look for is silence. Right? If community sees silence, it is a green light for further involvement by the white nationalist group or other far right or organizer to burrow deeper into that community. Silence in that instance is consent, and so it is important that when you see these things, that you find different ways in which you can engage in your community to speak out against it. A multiplicity of different ways to do it, but make sure that you do it. Democracy and protecting our civil and human rights, not a spectator sport. We all need to do it together to build that sense of beloved community.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both. Looking here, Andrea Dahl, you
Yeah.
are.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we cannot minimize this, because I was thinking all the time how the fascists did take over an entire nation in World War II with popular consent. Most of the people there in Germany backed it, supported it. So I know that it's not something we can take lightly. But I also want to just make a mention that I am so fortunate to hang out with people who think like me, and I think like them. And so we are all, we think of ourselves as compassionate, outgoing, loving people. And so when we hear about these hate groups, it's almost like, for me, it's like what? I don't know them, and I haven't been part of them. And so in some ways, I find it difficult to know how to get engaged with that. And I know that we must do it as a community, but it's also hard to come up with, you've given us many good ideas, but still it's hard to come up with the plan, so to speak. So.
I think it's important to say, Andrea, that we need to make a distinction between like white supremacy. There's a whole bunch of groups that Devin talked about today, which are all different, but also, also are coalescing around some things. But I'm going to use a broader term. There's a difference between people who are avowed white supremacists and then the kind of white supremacy that exists in me, in many of our ideas and attitudes, and exists in many organizations. And so all of us can work on white supremacy within ourselves and within the institutions and structures around us. And because facing that story, whenever we have a story, a piece of history we can't face, that's the history that controls us. So when we can face that, we can grow from it. So we can all work on that. And then I think we can also think over time about ways in which we can collaborate together with multiple organizations in different sectors of a community, and make sure that we have a unified stance when the group that Devin's talking about today is trying to destroy our democracy. And maybe part of that means building a coalition of people, sitting down for some coffee with some leaders of different organizations and crafting a game plan for the groups that actually are here. I mean, there was a guy who tried to run his car into me. That dude is part of a white nationalist group. There were stickers downtown from a white nationalist fight club. And maybe someone's trying to jerk our chain and that sort of thing. Well, you know, why would they even be wanting to do that? So I think, you know, we could think about getting some coalitions together of diverse groups saying, hey, we may disagree on lots of stuff, but we all agree that, you know, democratic principles need to be first and foremost, and that we're not going to be silent in the face of white supremacists and such in our community.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Anastasia, you are next.
Thank you. And Terry, thank you so much for saying some of these things. I am running for school board. I just want to make sure everyone knows that, but get that out of the way. And say that I'm focused on the children in particular, not just because of that, but because I also have young kids. But what you said, silence is consent, really struck home for me. And that what Devin was talking about, you know, looking for a community of silence, we have kids that are inherently in transition. That's kind of the deal with kids until they're grown up. So they're inevitably vulnerable to different ways of seeing the world. If we can start to teach them critical thinking skills so that they can look at anything, whatever, you know, what an ad, what is this ad really selling you? Starting from there, and then going into more detailed work about what does it mean to be white? What is that? What does that mean? Is that a culture? What is that? Can we talk about that a little bit? And what isn't it? And then start to talk about what they're hearing from their families. You know, I have a diverse family, and I have cousins in Texas, and I try so hard to get us into, and they're Republican, because not all Texans are Republican. We all know that, but these ones are, and Trumpsters, and there's no common denominator. Even when I bring down the common denominator of being family, that only goes so far. And then they want to win the argument. It's not about coming together. It's about winning the fight, winning the argument. So that's, I have to let that go. But if I'm really concerned about our future and the children that are inheriting what we're doing, what we're giving them, I want them to inherit knowing how to think about this and then how to respond to it, not react out of anger or this sense of needing to change things right away, but in a response that they know that they can continue doing through the whole course of their life, because it's going to come up again and again. And I need to make sure that they know how to think about it and respond to it in their heart way, in their loving way. You know, I keep going back to that idea about the frog in water. If you turn up the heat a little bit, you know, they get used to it. If you turn it up right away, it's hot and they jump out. And as a queer mom, you know, it's 2-mom family. I remember when we could be married legally, the feeling to be legally married federally. And I remember having our registered domestic partnership card, which felt a little not good, not a lot good really. But when we were able to be federally recognized for being married, I felt such relief. I felt safer than I didn't even know I felt unsafe. I felt so safe in knowing that I had more people behind me than I ever knew before. And it was such a gift. Anytime you go to vote for these things, it matters. It matters. It mattered to my family. It matters to my children, who knows that we're not, you know, some weird people over here that we have to pretend that we're not that. We get to be who we are, because that's part of America. That's who we are, right? Anyway, so thank you for that.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. It's really important. Okay, Sarah. Sarah, you've raised your hand as well. You're muted.
I'm unmuted now.
Oh,
Hey, it takes a minute. I wanted to talk about the school board. I think these issues are this time around going to be on the ballot. And in the primaries, we've got at least a couple of candidates who apparently are affiliated with anti-gay agendas, anti-critical race theory agendas, teaching fantasy history, maybe even creationism. So I just wanted to encourage people to get involved in those races. And while I'm on the grandstand, I would like to remind everybody that in that process where Terry was working with the city council, that we have somebody running for mayor right now who claimed at that time he didn't know what hate speech was, which I consider to be a completely ingenuous statement to protect himself as somebody who had white privilege from having to admit that hate exists, that racial hatred exists in our community. So I just wanted to return people to that comment so that we can keep it in front of us as we consider the mayoral race. So I really appreciate Anastasia running and Ryan running and all the people who are PCOs. So thank you for doing the work. But yeah, we definitely have local issues to work on. And I think the school board is definitely one of them right now.
agreed. Thank you. I think it's really, really important.
Hey, Barbara, can I just say one thing real quick? I've said too many things perhaps, and I want to make sure Devin gets in here, but I think it's important for us to say to people real clearly that I know I'm not a perfect person, but it is a strength when I can look at my failures and my mistakes and learn from them. And that doesn't mean I'm bad. And I think a lot of times, people on the left sometimes get into this purity business and start shaming and blaming people about being a racist or being this or being that. And I think that we don't help ourselves with that. So I think the more simple we can talk about it, the better. I'm a person, I've made mistakes. I have some great qualities, and it's a strength when I can learn from my mistakes. We have a history that is both beautiful and also incredibly horrific in this country. We can recognize the beauty and the aspirational constitutional values, and we can look at how we've fallen short, because looking at that helps us work for that more perfect union. And we got to find a way to bridge that thing and pull people a little bit out of their defensiveness a bit. At least some of them may come with us if we can do that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that, Sarah and Anastasia, I wanted to thank you for those comments, and the importance of the school board and public education is, near and dear to my heart. My wife is a high school chemistry teacher in the Seattle Public Schools. It is a long-term commitment to our work, and there is a long understanding of right now we're also experiencing an attack on the attempt to bring about discussions around racism and homophobia and attacks on, transgendered youth and others, coming from the far right and using it as a wedge to try to divide our communities. And the target, the locus of that effort is in the public school system, trying to use school boards to try and do that kind of targeting. So it is one of those areas where school boards are on the front line of this culture war around who and what we are as a nation in the 21st century, and seeking to define it for the next generation as well. So I applaud all that you're doing, and I want to make sure to echo, the importance that Terry put on it, how important it is for us to think about these things at every single level of government, and how this stuff can play out and influence our lives. I think about the story of over in Squim. Squim is a community that is developed largely into a retirement community for lots of folks from around the state. Unbeknownst to many who weren't paying attention, they ended up with a situation where they have a QAnon supporter as their mayor. As a result of that, they now have a tarnished reputation around the country because of the kind of impact that that's had, both locally in terms of their kind of racist efforts to tarnish a tribal effort to put a methadone clinic in the community to help community members deal with the problems around opioid addiction, and the kind of anti-indigenous rhetoric that came up around that. And then kind of nationally being known as, oh, you're the city with the QAnon mayor. That has ramifications that last long before it. So while it may not have seemed important at the time, I can tell you from talking with folks over there now, oh boy, do they wish they would have taken it seriously sooner. They would have a lot less headaches. But now they're thankfully mobilizing and organizing to take their community back and to make it clear that their community doesn't represent those kind of values and those ideas. It's just harder once it's sunk root to do that kind of work. So congratulations to all of you for doing that hard work before it gets too late.
Yeah, thank you. Are there any more comments or questions?
Oh, how do we get, what do we have, honey?
Okay, I'm going to thank Devin. Thank you so much for coming, and Terry, thank you as well. Really appreciate the work that both of you do locally and in Seattle and all over the country. It's making a huge difference, and it just really helps me feel a little more relaxed that there are people out there doing these things and working on these issues, because it's really a kind of, it's not an unusual time, but it is a difficult time with these kinds of groups and what's going on. So really appreciate it. And I'm going to thank Anthony, even though he's not here, for just coming on for a few minutes, because that was really nice to see him. He's a wonderful man, and family is really important. So I'm going to also thank Brad, who was our computer guy. He's the technician that makes it happen. Without him, quite honestly, these meetings would not be happening, because he's just wonderful to do all that. And I want to thank everybody who's come on to part of this discussion. And I know a lot of the people in this meeting are very active people, and they're out there doing wonderful, wonderful work. Thank you all for running, all of you who are running. I know how very difficult it can be. So thank you all for all that you're doing as well. I'm going to end the meeting in a few minutes, but I'll stay on if anybody wants to stay on and talk and visit. It's 8:44 and the light is still on and the sky is looking beautiful. So if people want to chat, that's great. And I'll stay on for a few minutes. If anyone has anything else they'd like to share before a lot of folks get off, please let me know. Okay. Well, again, thank you all, and especially Terry and Devin for everything. And I don't know what else to say, but thank you, thank you, thank you. And